The tools that I'm about to share with you in this divorce survival guide are based on the work that I've done with hundreds of divorced and separated men over the last couple years. And as you might imagine, in that time, I've seen a lot of different things. In general, I've seen a lot of men who get better, right? Who rebuild their lives, who find purpose and meaning, who start dating, who find love again. I've also seen a lot of men who don't. And in just a moment, we are going to jump into this survival guide. We're going to look at where you're at in the divorce recovery spectrum. I'm going to help you figure out how to identify what stage you're in. And then I'm going to give you specific tools and resources and exercises to help you keep moving forward through that so you can be one of the guys who gets better. But first, I want to give you a couple of case studies because I know what you might be thinking, right? That the guys who get better aren't the guys like me. They're the guys that are younger, that haven't been married as long, that don't have children or don't have young children, right? They're the guys whose divorces were amicable. And trust me, I used to think that that was the case too, that the guys who got better would be the ones who were having an easier time of it. But it's not true. For example, look at Mark. Mark is 65 years old, married for 37 years, grown children, grandchildren, right? And the divorce was a shock for him. He did not see it coming, and yet only 7 months after he got the news, Mark is looking forward. And that's one of the things that is so hard to do when you get hit by this, because depression pulls you down and it makes the future almost impossible to envision. But Mark is not only looking forward, but he's building a future for himself actively at 65 years old after almost 4 decades of marriage. He is an inspiration. And in just a moment, we're going to talk about how that's possible for him. And then there's Bob. Bob, you might have seen my interview with him here on YouTube. He shared some of his story with us and about his experience in my coaching program. But Bob went through one of the worst betrayals that you can have, his wife with his best friend. And not only that, but they got pregnant. And so here's Bob, only a year after his wife left, right? And in that year, imagine what happened. She's with his best friend. They have a child. Meanwhile, she and Bob have 2 young children, so it's not like he can just get away from her. He's actually got a co-parent with her. And yet just a year later, here he is in a new relationship telling me, you know, it's crazy to say this, but I feel closer to this woman I've been dating for 4 months than I ever did to my ex-wife. And it's because Bob did the things that we're about to talk about in this divorce survival guide. He applied the tools, he did the exercises, and it enabled him to be more genuine, more vulnerable, more open with this new partner in ways that he simply couldn't be with his ex-wife. I worked with a client who had been divorced for 6 years and was still stuck. Some of you might relate to that, just unable to move forward. His ex-wife was already remarried, and here he was in a dead-end job, working only nights, horrible schedule, unhappy. He'd given away way too much in the divorce because he couldn't deal with the emotional pain and just wanted it over, and here he is stuck. Just 6 months after applying these tools, he had started this amazing side business he'd been wanting to do for ages in art. He had changed his schedule at work. He was moving and getting a promotion. He was able to put his life in motion by applying the kinds of things that we're going to talk about later in this video. I worked with a man who was 70 years old. Second divorce. He'd been married, I think, 20 years the second time. He had not only grown children, but grown stepchildren and grandkids. Dating. Right? Out dating, meeting amazing women, and actually finding one of those relationships deepening into something new. So starting a new chapter of his life at 70 years old after 2 divorces. I've also worked with men who have been accused of horrible things by their ex-wives. Narcissism, abuse, even bigamy. And yet these guys not only find ways to co-parent effectively with these women, which is astounding, but to really move forward with their lives, to let it go, to stop thinking about her, stop trying to change her, and move on with their lives, dating, up-leveling their careers, starting new businesses. It is incredible and it is inspiring, the amount of opportunity that exists in divorce, the amount of opportunity that I see men finding every single day, coming out of something that is like hands down the most painful, difficult, challenging experience you can face. I consistently hear both things from men, that divorce is the hardest thing. It's harder than losing somebody who dies. It's harder than going to war. And I hear this from war veterans all of the time, that this is the hardest thing. This is the most difficult thing I've ever had to face. But I also hear men telling me, wow, I never would have gotten where I am if this hadn't happened. I never would have grown in these ways. I never would have healed in these ways. I never would have been capable of having the kind of intimate vulnerable connection that I have now. There's such an opportunity here, whether you've been married for 40 years or 4 years, whether you have small children or you're 70 years old. There's so much opportunity for you, and yet so many men never find that. I guarantee that there is somebody, one of you watching this right now, who has been watching my videos for over a year and still feels stuck, right? Or maybe even feels worse than you did a year ago. I get emails about it all of the time. Rachel, I'm still stuck. Rachel, I can't let go. I can't move forward. What the fuck is wrong with me, right? A year later, 2 years later, 6 years, 10 years, 12 years later, time's not doing the work. So what is the difference? What is the difference between the guys who move forward and heal and the ones who don't? I can tell you what it isn't. It's not age. It's not the intensity of the betrayal, the complexity of the divorce, the amount of money lost, how many divorces you've been through, whether or not you have kids. It's none of that. I thought it would be, but it isn't. In my experience, the data that I've gathered from the men I've talked to, it is both a lot simpler and a lot more complex than that. The simple answer is that the men who get better are the ones who do the work. And when I say the work, I mean the simple self-reflection, self-inquiry, emotional regulation exercises that we're going to talk about here in this divorce survival guide. These exercises can be intense. They ask you to look at things that hurt, but I guarantee you they're nowhere near as painful as what most of you are dealing with already going through this divorce. The men who get better are the ones who do it a little bit every day or almost every day, consistently over a period of months. But this begs the question, if I'm saying all you need to do are these brief exercises most days of the week for a few months, why do so many men not do that? Right? And this is where it gets more complex, and I'm not going to go too deep into it, but there's 2 things I want to touch on, because you might find as we go through this divorce survival guide that you have a hard time either starting or sticking with some of the actions I'm going to ask you to take. So the 2 big reasons I see, one is just a lack of belief, that it's hard to believe that it's going to get better. And when you are deep in it, when you are in the darkness, it can be almost impossible to even see a glimpse of the light. And you guys, that's why I do these videos. That's why I try to share some of these stories with you. That's why I try to explain how specifically we can do these things so that your brain can start to imagine that maybe it just might be possible for you to get there too. There are a lot of other reasons that people get stuck or that they don't do the work. But the other big one that I want to talk about today, in case it applies to you, is trauma. And that might be big T trauma, like childhood abuse or sexual abuse or domestic violence. But it can also be what Dr. Gabor Mate calls little t trauma. And this is what unfortunately happens to so many children now. It's when you learn, for whatever reason, as a child, that your needs are not going to be met and there's nothing you can do about it. Right? That either your needs aren't getting met or you're actively being hurt in some way, physically or emotionally, and there's nowhere for you to run and there's no way for you to fight back. People with any kind of history of relational trauma tend to get stuck. They tend to struggle to take the kind of actions that would help them heal, like the ones I'm about to show you in this survival guide. And it's important to know that this is not a weakness in them. It's not a flaw in them. It is just a predictable physiologic response to what happened to them. So if you have trauma in your history, big T or little t trauma, please pay attention to this. There's an amazing video here on YouTube with Seth Porges, who explains what happens to the nervous system. The nervous system responds to trauma in predictable ways. Trauma is an injury to the nervous system. And just like we can predict how the body is going to respond to a physical injury, we can predict how the nervous system is going to respond to a relational injury. When the nervous system goes through trauma, it experiences a freeze response. And that's what Seth Porges talks a lot about in this video. There's the link here above me. A deep dive into that trauma response and how to deal with it and how it impacts you if you're going through a divorce is a topic for another day. But what I will say about it here is that if that's the case for you, if you have any kind of trauma history and you're feeling stuck with this, get help. Work with a coach, work with a therapist, work with a counselor. There is no shame in it. It is not a statement about you. The fact is that the human nervous system evolved to co-regulate, which means it is easier to help the nervous system break free from that freeze state with the support of other people. It's just a physiological fact about how our nervous systems work. It's just like if you had a broken bone, you would go to the doctor to set your leg and put the cast on so that it would heal properly. Well, for your nervous system to heal properly, you need the support of other people. So if that's something you're dealing with, getting help getting support, direct support from somebody who understands how the nervous system works is going to make a huge difference and enable you to start taking these actions that are going to help you heal. All right, guys, let's jump in and do the divorce survival guide. When it comes to surviving divorce and then rebuilding your life, success hinges on emotional survival. It's on learning to effectively deal with, regulate, and even control the difficult and overwhelming emotions that come up around divorce. And unfortunately, that's something that most men in our modern society are really never taught about. They're not taught to prioritize emotions, and they're not given the skills they need to manage them effectively. Right? The advice most men get are things like man up or tough it out, or even like go get laid and just get over it. And that is why this divorce survival guide is all about dealing with emotions. We're going to go through 9 emotional stages that men experience during divorce, and I break it down and give you tools to deal with each one. Because here's the thing, once those things are handled, you can do the rest of it. You know how to rebuild your life. You have the experience, you have the wisdom, you have the knowledge that you need if you're not completely crippled or hobbled by grief and despair and anxiety and overwhelm. This is what I see in my coaching practice again and again. When we get the emotions dealt with, when we get the anger and the sorrow and the grief and the loneliness and the depression, when we get those emotions wrangled, men have the rest of it. They are so incredibly resourceful when it comes to rebuilding their lives. And this is one of the things I love about my work as a coach is once we turn that emotional corner, I'm the one who's learning from you. Right? My clients are the ones who are bringing these incredible insights and wisdom and experience and changes. Like I'm always surprised at what they come up with and where they go and how far they go. So what we're going to do in this survival guide is I'm going to show you how to figure out where you're at, which emotional stage you're in, and what the concrete practical things are that you can do in that stage. Because once that's taken care of, you've got this. If you'd like to follow along with me in this guide, go ahead and pause this video and go down to the video description. There's a link there. You can download the entire emotional stages of divorce survival guide and follow along with me as we go through it. All right, guys, so you can read through this introduction to the guide on your own. Again, you can download it from the video description below. But there's just a couple of things that I want to say. These emotional stages are going to be very similar to the stages of grief. There's a lot of different models. Usually you'll see 7. There's 2 additional stages that I'm including here because I see them coming up and they're not always addressed in those traditional grief models, but they definitely come up for almost every man I've seen going through divorce. And the other thing you should know about these stages is this is not a linear process. It's not like you start at stage 1 and you go right through to the end. You're going to move back and forth. These are emotional states and they are fluid, and depending on your circumstances, what's going on in your life, your personal history, what crazy thing your ex-wife does next, it's going to trigger you into different emotional stages. So please don't look at this as a progression, as something you should move through. Just identify where you are now, do the work there. And what you're going to find is that over time, the intensity of the emotions diminishes, the amount of time that you stay in positive states increases. And yes, even when you're in like the acceptance and hope stage, you're going to go back. You're going to hit anger. You're going to hit depression. You're going to hit sorrow. It's okay. It's going to get easier and easier to move out of those states and come back to that place of acceptance and hope. So that's what we're looking for. We're not just going to move through, but the amount of time and the intensity of each of these stages is going to decrease, and you're going to feel more and more capable of moving out of them into healthier, happier mental and emotional states more quickly when these emotions do come up. Okay, so here are the 9 emotional stages that I see men going through in divorce. Yes, there's more than these. You'll notice more emotions coming up for you. These are the big ones. And if you can identify where you're at in each of these and do the work, you're going to make massive progress. So since you guys can download this guide and go through it, I'm not going to go through every single point here. You can look through it on your own. I'm just going to hit a couple of the big ones, and there's some places where I really see people getting stuck, so we're going to focus on those. So I'm actually going to skip over shock right now. You can read through that on your own. But I do want to pause here and look at denial. Denial is hard because the whole point of it is that you don't know that you're in it, right? So there's a few ways you can identify if you're in the denial stage. A big one is if your ex-wife has already filed for the divorce and you don't have a lawyer yet, you're in this stage. Other signs are like minimizing the seriousness of the situation to your friend, saying, oh yeah, she left, but she's gonna come back. It's all gonna be okay. A big one, a big sign that I often see men doing even years after the separation or divorce is that you're still playing the husband, even though you're not with her, right? She might even be with somebody else, but you find yourself going over there and like fixing things for her, or helping her with her vehicles, or just like jumping to pick up the phone, or doing things for the kids when it's her time to be taking care of them, like stepping in and playing the role of her husband, even though you're not really being invited into that role in its entirety. And sometimes women really enable this or encourage it because it's nice, right? To have this guy who will help out and fix things and take care of the house and step up with the kids and do all of these things to support you, but you don't actually have to give anything back into that relationship. And it can actually become a really unhealthy cycle for both people. So if you're still playing the husband, even though she's not allowing you to be her husband in every other way, that's a pretty strong sign that you're in denial. And so there's something really important for you guys to know about this if you're here. If you're in denial, you want your wife back, and that's okay. You can still do this work. I think a lot of guys don't do the internal work because they don't want to accept that the divorce is happening because they don't want to lose their wives. I have a lot of clients who reconcile. It is not the goal of my coaching program, right? I work with men in better beyond divorce. It's all about moving forward from divorce. But I always, especially in my 6-month intensive coaching program, I always have men who are reconciling, at least one who's going through that. And here's the thing, you guys, they don't reconcile when they're in the denial stage. They reconcile when they're in acceptance. And I think it's because you and your wife can't go back to what was. If you're going through a separation or divorce, that means that the marriage wasn't good for you, it wasn't good for her. There were things that were not working, and you cannot go back to that relationship exactly the way it was. If you're going to reconcile, you're going to be starting something new together, and you're going to need to be different, and she's going to need to be different, and everyone's going to need to be showing up with more awareness, more curiosity, and the willingness to build something that is healthier, that it works better for both people involved. If you're in denial, you're holding on to what was. And I've never seen anyone reconcile in that state. I've only seen people reconcile when they accept that what was has to be let go of. Doesn't mean there's no future for you and your wife. Often there is. People do reconcile. I see it all the time. But reconciliation is not going back. It's going forward into a new relationship with your wife. So if you notice any of the signs of denial in yourself, I hope that that is helpful for you, because if you can do the work in denial, recognize that what was is over, and start to accept that, it not only is going to help you move on if the divorce does get finalized, it's also going to improve your chances of reconciling with your wife. Okay, so the guide has a couple of steps here. One is just really practical. If you're in the midst of a divorce and you don't have a lawyer, get one. The second piece of advice here is to really sit down and confront your fears. You can always do this with a coach or a therapist or a good friend. Usually denial is in part a way of protecting ourselves from grief, because if I accept this, I'm gonna have to feel the pain of what I've lost. And that pain might feel intolerable or unmanageable. So a coach or a therapist can help you manage the pain, and I promise you it is manageable. Emotional pain is no different than physical pain. And I am sure you've experienced a fair amount of physical pain in your life. So you can learn to experience emotional pain in the same way, and you can get through it. Having help will help. But the first step is to sit down and get curious. What am I afraid I might have to feel if I accept that this is happening? All right, guys, the guide has a couple of other steps that you can take in denial. I want to move on, though, and talk about anger. In this Stages of Divorce Survival Guide, I've lumped anger and resentment together because they are like the two edges of a very, very sharp sword. Anger can be an incredibly powerful resource. I am a firm believer that anger saves lives because it moves us out of depression, and depression can kill us, right? Depression kills a lot of divorced men through suicide. And anger is a really powerful way to move out of that. If you think of it from a nervous system perspective, depression, we're in a freeze state, we're trapped, there's nothing we can do, we are being hurt, we are suffering, and there's no way out. So no wonder people head to suicide. Anger is in fight or flight. If we're in anger, there's a sense that we can fight, that we will fight, that there's things we can do, there's actions we can take. That is a much safer, more empowered place than that trapped feeling of depression. So I think for a lot of people that anger is really important during divorce. It's a it's a stage that you don't necessarily want to rush out of, because it can be the thing that's taking you out of depression, bringing you back to life, back to this place of energy and motivation where you can fight for your right to be here, to be loved, to be happy. So that's the edge of the sword I like. If anger stays around too long, it does turn into bitterness and resentment, and that can keep people stuck for a very, very long time. And it can actually start to take you back to depression because there can be an element of hopelessness to it. So with anger, we're walking a line. And this is where some self-awareness and curiosity comes in. If you're noticing that you're angry a lot, and signs that you're in this stage are that you're easily triggered into anger, it's hard to think about or be around your ex without feeling angry, frustration's kind of a constant presence. Other signs that you're in anger and resentment are that it's really hard to trust women, like in general. You might find yourself drawn towards like the red pill, the MGTOW kind of rhetoric. And it can also feel like the whole world is against you, right? Not just your ex-wife. So if you're experiencing anger, it's important to notice, like, what is the anger doing for you? And you'll find more about this here in the guide, but find the positive intention behind the anger and start to separate that out from feelings of resentment and bitterness. So we want to separate out the resources that anger gives us from the obstacles that it can create in our lives. There's some other exercises you can do with anger. One is adjusting the volume. This one's kind of fun. You can do it with other emotions too. You can actually picture, I know it might sound silly, but picture a big dial or a remote control and just imagine turning the volume down on your anger and see what happens. This is where having a little guidance with a coach or a therapist can be helpful, because you'll do some of these exercises. This is an NLP technique. Sometimes they work really well and you're like, wow, I just turned down the volume of that emotion. That's amazing. Other times it'll like flare up aggressively. If that happens, there's a reason. Right? There's something that anger is trying to do for you. And that often happens if you're kind of at that edge between depression and anger, and the anger is really trying to protect you and keep you here and keep you fighting. So again, as you do these exercises, please stay curious. If they don't work in the way you're expecting, ask yourself why. What is the reaction, the emotional reaction I'm having trying to do for me? All right, guys, again, there's more tools, there's more exercises in the guide here on what to do with anger, but we are gonna skip ahead to sorrow. And I want to talk about sorrow for a minute, because this is one that's often not part of traditional models of moving through grief. And yet working through sadness and coming to terms with sadness and really creating a healthy relationship with it has been a key part of the divorce recovery journey of every man I've ever worked with. I haven't yet found a way around working with sorrow. So some signs that you're here are crying, maybe a little, maybe a lot, maybe like more than you ever have in your whole life. Small things can trigger strong sadness when you're in this sorrow stage or the sorrow state. Watching a movie, walking down a familiar street, music can be a big trigger of grief. And another telltale sign is that when you think of your ex, you feel pain in your chest. In my experience, most people experience sadness and sorrow in the space of their heart. And as you'll see here in the guide, working with sorrow is a little bit of a balancing act, because you can't keep it in. That won't help. It'll just erupt later and more strongly and in more disruptive ways. So you need to feel it, you need to allow it. But a lot of people make the mistake of not only allowing it, but feeding it, right? The sad song triggers the sorrow. And then I find myself listening to the whole sad soundtrack and replaying all of the sad memories and all of the good memories that I don't have anymore. And that sadness can be something that we start to feed and grow, instead of something that we feel and let out and let move through us. So we want to let emotions like sadness move through us without grabbing onto it and feeding it. I won't spend much more time in sorrow, guys. There's more details in the guide. There's, I think, 3 or 4 more specific things that you can do to work with sorrow. We're going to move on. The last area of this that we're going to look at today is testing. And it's not an emotion, but it is a stage. It is an emotional stage. And I guess if we had to tie an emotion to it, I would say that in testing, you're curious. This is a really cool place to be, because you've already been through so much. If the divorce happens and it's like the foundation has been ripped out from under you, you're plunged into the darkness. There's nothing to hold on to. you're just trying to stay alive, you're trying to survive it. Not everybody does. But if you do, you gather strength, you gather some wisdom, you move through these other stages, you gather some support around you, and you get to a point where you find yourself turning back to life. And that is what the testing stage is. It's where you start to get curious. Is it possible? Could I have a future? What might that look like? What might that feel like? What could potentially maybe be out there for me next? It's at this stage where I actually get a lot of my clients, right? This is when they're ready to start something like a coaching program or looking for support or saying, okay, I think there's another side. I can see the light. I want to start moving towards it. What might that look like? And so you start trying things, right? You start dating, you start connecting with people. Maybe you try on new hobbies. Maybe you join a program or a support group. And if you are somebody who spends a lot of time looking things up online or looking for some answers or support here on the internet, you'll find that your searches change, right? You'll start to be looking up things about moving on instead of searching things about what went wrong and how to get her back and how to stop what's happening. And so the whole feel of what you start Googling or searching for on YouTube will change. And so I'm going to go through what the guide has to tell you about this testing stage, because I think the things to do there are so important. And if you're watching this video, you might be starting to dip your toe into that testing stage. So embrace it. Intentionally foster that curiosity. Ask questions, ask more questions. And instead of asking negative questions like, what went wrong? Start intentionally asking positive questions like, how did that guy get there? I wonder how many people have succeeded in their second marriages. I wonder how many people do find love after divorce, right? Start to intentionally get curious about other people's experiences, what might be possible, what might be out there. Another thing you can do in the testing stage is to practice positive self-talk, but be careful here. I'm not talking about just like, oh, I'm so grateful for all the amazing things the world has to offer. Like, don't lie to yourself. Don't try to be positive beyond where you are. Just be honest with yourself. Talk to yourself in an encouraging, positive way like you would to a friend or a child, but don't lie. Or tell yourself things like, yeah, this is scary. The idea of going out and dating, I'm scared I might get rejected. I don't know where this is going to go. And I'm really hopeful and I'm excited to try. And I'm looking forward to the chance that I might find a way to connect or to feel close to someone again. Right? Don't tell your brain bullshit, because it will see right through it. But give yourself honest, genuine, gentle encouragement. And finally, in the testing stage, don't give up, because you are going to have setbacks. Remember, this is not a linear journey. You're going to put yourself out there. You're going to try a program. You're going to start dating. You're going to go for something in your job or your business or your career, and it's not going to work. You're going to get rejected. You're going to get shot down. You're going to find yourself angry or depressed or in grief again. Don't give up. Right? That's normal. It's part of moving forward. It's part of the progress, is to feel better, come up, try things, fall back down. And every time you get knocked back down, it's going to get a little bit easier. You're getting a little more resilient. You know the way back up and out. So keep trying, keep testing, stay curious, and really foster this stage, because it has so much to offer. All right, guys, if you are still with me, thank you. This was a long video and I really appreciate you hanging out with me. Please download the Stages of Divorce Survival Guide. There is so much good information here, and it's just more than we can cover in the space of this YouTube video. So thank you for watching. Please download the guide, and I look forward to seeing you guys in the next video.